For Chatham-Kent, Leamington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the debate at second reading and through committee hearings, and now finally in the final debate, mounds and mounds of evidence have been introduced and cited, painting a grim picture of the consequence of this government's determination to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes. And still, this Liberal government is bound and determined to ram this legislation through so that by July 1st, 2018, Canada's 151st birthday, youth as young as 18 can legally purchase marijuana from government outlets and use this drug with virtually no restrictions. I have been allotted 20 minutes to present my objections to this harmful legislation, but would need hours to present all the evidence presented by doctors, psychiatrists, researchers, police, parents, and a host of specialists warning the government not to go down this road and the serious consequences if they do. I will instead focus on a few articles and studies and ask the members across the floor how they can justify their actions, having had prior knowledge to these. Mr. Speaker, I hold in my hand a mandate letters from the Prime Minister to ministers on expectations and deliveries, and I will be using that in my presentation to point out just how this action by the Prime Minister has been broken by his ministers. The Prime Minister presented all ministers with these mandate letters after the last election. To the Minister of Health, the mandate from the Minister reads, I expect you to work closely with your Deputy Minister and his or her senior officials to ensure that the ongoing work of your department is undertaken in a professional manner and that decisions are made in the public interest. I wonder if the Minister at that point informed the Prime Minister about this document from her own department, modified in August 19th, 2016. I'm sure she was aware of it. And this document, amongst other things, states, using cannabis or any cannabis product can impair your concentration, your ability to think and make decisions, and your reaction time and coordination. This can affect your motor skills, including your ability to drive. It can also increase anxiety and cause panic attacks, and in some cases, cause paranoia and hallucinations. When the product should not be used, it further states, under the age of 25, also allergic or cannabinoid or to smoke, have serious liver, kidney, heart, or lung disease, have a personal or family history of serious mental disorders such as schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, or bipolar disorder, are pregnant, are planning to get pregnant, are breastfeeding, are a man who wishes to start a family, have a history of alcohol or drug abuse, or substance dependence. A list of health outcomes regulated to the short and long term of those include the following: increased risk of triggering and aggressively psychotic and or mood disorders, schizophrenia, psychosis, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, decreased sperm count, concentration and mortality, and increased abnormal sperm morpholia, negatively impacting the behavioral and cognitive development of children born to mothers who use cannabis during pregnancy. This document was available to the minister and clearly shows that in reaction to that, she's breaking what the Prime Minister instructed her to do. I want to read another the Prime Minister has written. No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous people. To the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, in his opening statement, the Prime Minister, and I quoted that quote, why didn't the Minister sound the alarm and give the Prime Minister the message that she received from the President Aluki Katorik of the Nunavik, And she says, The government needs to consult with Inuit or other cannabis and should be legal with other Inuit or whether cannabis should be legalized, and if so, when, as well as plans to deal with the possible negative impacts of legalizing marijuana. She further goes on, and this is from Chief Gina Deer of the Council of the Kanawaki of the Mohawk Council. Our community has had zero tolerance for many years on drugs, Deer said. Now, when you tell them that we have to accept marijuana as a legal product and not as a drug, it's hard to accept, especially for elders. The PM further stated to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, I expect you to re-engage in a renewed nation-to-nation process with Indigenous people to make real progress on the issues most important to First Nations, the Métis Nation and Inuit communities. Issues like housing, employment, and here we go again, health and mental health care. This is what Chief Isidore Day testified at the committee. First Nations. First Nations are not prepared to deal with the ramifications of Bill 45. In fact, he added, does Canada even know the full impacts of cannabis? And further, Chief Day also reminded the committee that American Indian tribes are negatively impacted when Colorado and Washington legalized cannabis. Yet despite hearing this, the Liberals continue to reaffirm that it's important that we focus on getting this job done as quickly as we are able. And I'm still quoting. The Chief reiterated that one of the biggest concerns that First Nations have with Bill C-45 is the health and safety of our people. He cited statistics that cannabis is the second most abused substance amongst Indigenous people. In Ontario alone, he added, $33 million is needed to treat First Nations with drug and alcohol addictions. He concluded by stating, there appears to be more questions than answers. This leads First Nations in a compromising state, leading in an accelerated timeline. The Prime Minister also said to the Minister, work with the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs to address gaps in services to Aboriginal people and those with mental illnesses. She should have told him about the health report that I mentioned previously and the concerns that her own government and his own government had with the legalization of marijuana and the usage of marijuana. Health Canada's warnings stated, and I've mentioned some, but it serves to mention these as well. Cannabis contains hundreds of substances, some of which can affect the proper functioning of the brain and the central nervous system. The use of this product involves risk to health, some of which may not be known or fully understood. And amongst other things, that the cannabis, and it's written in bold letters, should not be used if you have a personal or family history of serious mental disorders such as schizophrenia. To the Minister of Justice, who just spoke, the Prime Minister loves to point out his great love and respect for the Charter. And in his mandate to the Minister, he stated, you are expected to ensure that the rights of Canadians are protected, that our work demonstrates the greatest possible commitment to respecting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Well, Child Advocate Group in New Brunswick has done an assessment to violations to the rights of the Child Treaty, and a very serious concern that this legislation is going to see legal challenges. I wonder if she should have told the Prime Minister, a court challenge, is what they have stated, is a good idea under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And Section 7 says, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. She should have warned him. By legalizing marijuana, a drug with psychoactive properties, the Government of Canada will encourage the sale and consumption of marijuana, thereby putting all Canadians at greater risk of encountering harm and death through impaired driving accidents, workplace accidents, smoking-related sicknesses, and other marijuana-induced injuries. For example, police chiefs across the country have expressed their concern that they will not be able to keep the public safe from drugged drivers. Thus, the proposal to legalize marijuana runs contrary to the Charter provision, the right to security of the person. The Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, he writes, as Minister, your overarching goal will be to lead our government's work in ensuring that we are keeping Canadians safe. Here again, Mr. Speaker, I would raise the report from the Health Department. But I would also make mention of the report that was just come out from the legalization of marijuana in Colorado, the impact, an executive summary that states marijuana related traffic deaths when a driver was positive for marijuana more than doubled, from 55 deaths in 2013 to 135 deaths in 2016. Whoa. I would also say that this same executive summary claims in 2009, Colorado marijuana-related traffic deaths involving drivers tested positive for marijuana represented 9% of the traffic deaths. By 2016, that number was more than doubled to 20%. It goes on, and there's statistics that talk about what happens to the youth and how the youth increase has risen dramatically as well. Then to the Minister of Science. And I think, Mr. Speaker, this might be my favorite. The Prime Minister writes to the Minister of Science, the same minister who has repeatedly in this House stood up and said that government, she refers to herself as our government, that government will listen to science. Because the Prime Minister told her, we are a government that believes in science and a government that believes that good scientific knowledge should inform decision-making. Wow. I should read that again. We are a government that believes in science and a government that believes that good science knowledge should inform decision-making. And I wonder if that minister told the Prime Minister about the legalization of marijuana in Colorado report, or possibly this report from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And here's a great one she should have read, from the Frontiers of Psychiatry. Persistency of cannabis use predicts violence following acute psychotic discharge. And then this lengthy report from the World Health Organization, the health and social effects of non-medical cannabis use. It goes on and on. I'm sure she read the market analysis of plant-based drugs from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. And every one, Mr. Speaker, every one of these reports points to the same conclusion, that the use of cannabis is restricted for a reason. And there's a reason why governments have on a continual basis, have made that their practice. To the members of the Liberal caucus, and I've often stated in this House, and I genuinely am impressed with this caucus. It's full of doctors and lawyers and PhDs and Rhodes Scholars. Chief police. This is not a group of people that could be excused just from not having the information. And I found this great article by James DeFore, I hope I said his name right, written in the Huffington Post, and I'm just going to read an excerpt of that. He writes, I've written about my modest contribution to the elimination of pot prohibition before. To recap, in 2011, I was hired by the Liberal government, Canada's upper brass, to pressure their delegates to vote yes on a policy initiative that would push for legalization. For 3 months, my team approached marijuana advocacy groups and rallied their members to bombard all delegates via email, tweets, and Facebook messages. The plan was to put enough pressure on delegates until they voted for a Canada who would shed its draconian views on weed. When we started, now listen here, just 30% of delegates, 30% of that caucus were in the camp. After the votes were tallied at the Liberals' 2012 convention, more than 75% of delegates voted yes. Wow. You know, this group can make the right choice. And I know that there are many in this caucus on the other side that are opposed to what this government is doing, what their prime minister is forcing them to do as well. And now is the time. Now is the time for them to stand up and make those changes, or to make the right choices, and to vote against this dangerous bill. I might add to the Prime Minister, you're not leading a bold charge that will take you or make you an example of progressive nations. Listen to what the Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, said in a recent interview, and I quote, "This sentiment is reflected," and they were talking about the use of marijuana, in a remark that Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte made during a 2014 interview. "People should do with their own bodies whatever they please, as long as they're well informed about the junk that goes about the junk and what it does to them." The Dutch have a different approach to the whole idea about marijuana. Rutte added in the same interview that cannabis legalization of the Colorado model, and I should emphasize that the Colorado model is 21 years old and over, where the state taxes regulate all levels of the supply chain, and adults 21 and over are allowed to purchase weed from state licensed stores, was out of the question. And he says, if we were to do that, we'd be the laughing stock of Europe. So this is not going to be a progressive move by our Prime Minister and by this caucus. As a matter of fact, the UN forbids legislation of recreation. While the Dutch system has some major drawbacks, the current UN treaties forbid countries to legalize and regulate drugs for recreational use. Specifically, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs from 1961 states that member states have a general obligation to limit exclusively to medical and scientific purposes the production, manufacture, export, import, and distribution of, trade-in, and use of possession of drugs. Piet Hein van Kempen, a professor of criminal law and criminal procedure in the Netherlands, was recently asked by the Justice Ministry to study if international drug treaties offer any wiggle room to legalize, decriminalize, tolerate, or to regulate cannabis in any other way for recreational use. His answer was an emphatic no. And maybe the Prime Minister, when he gets to meet his new best friend, Xi Jinping, and he tell him about his plans to legalize marijuana, and ask him what his thoughts were, and I'm sure that he would give him a history lesson of what took place in Chinese society. Well, Mr. Chair, I'm running out of time. The Liberals are on track to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes by July the 1st. They say, in 2018, they say that they have had extensive consultations, conducted the largest online survey, and completed a report called A Framework for the Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis in Canada. The Liberals say that they have consulted with Canadians, provincial, territorial, municipal governments, Indigenous governments, and representatives of organizations, youth, parents, experts, and experts in relevant fields. Ignoring the warnings of doctors, police chiefs, First Nations parents, they have pushed this bill rapidly through the House. This bill will drastically change Canadian society, the full ramifications felt for years to come. They say it will protect youth and take marijuana out of the hands of criminals. I suggest it will enslave our youth and make the governments the new pusher on the block. And Mr. Speaker, I have a motion, seconded by the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word "that" and substituting the following: Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts, be now read a third time, but be referred back to the Standing Committee on Health for the purpose of reconsidering Clause 226, with a view to establish a coming into force date that complies with the wishes of those provinces, territories, municipalities, law enforcement officials, and First Nation groups who require more time to prepare for the legalization of cannabis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.